Before 1833, the British Empire was built on the backs of enslaved people. Millions of African men, women and children were taken from their homes. They were forced onto crowded and dangerous ships. This journey was called the Middle Passage. Many did not survive. Those who did were taken to British colonies. They were sold like property. They were forced to work on plantations, especially in the Caribbean. These plantations grew sugar, cotton and tobacco. These goods made Britain very rich. The system was brutal and dehumanizing, designed to extract the maximum amount of labor through force and fear. Life for the enslaved was one of constant hardship and suffering. They had no rights. They could be bought and sold at any time. Their families could be torn apart. Husbands were separated from wives, and children were taken from their parents. They worked long hours in the hot sun. They were often given very little food and lived in poor conditions. If they resisted or did not work hard enough, they faced terrible punishments. They were whipped, beaten, or worse. This system was designed to break their spirit, but for many, the desire for freedom never died. It was a daily struggle for survival in a world that saw them as less than human. The enslaved people were not just in the Caribbean. Slavery existed in many parts of the British Empire. This included North America before the American Revolution. It also included parts of South America and Africa. The people who were enslaved were almost all from Africa. They were captured in wars or kidnapped from their villages. They were then sold to European slave traders. This trade created a huge amount of wealth for Britain. Cities like Liverpool, Bristol and London grew rich from the slave trade. The money from slavery helped to build Britain's industries and fund its expansion across the globe. The entire system was justified by racist ideas. British society created stories and beliefs that African people were inferior. These ideas were used to make slavery seem normal or even necessary. They claimed that enslaved people were not capable of looking after themselves. This was a lie used to defend a cruel and profitable system. This racism did not just stay on the plantations. It spread throughout the British Empire. It shaped how people of African descent were treated for centuries. Understanding this history is important. It helps us see how the wealth of the empire was connected to the suffering of millions. The fight to end slavery was long and difficult. It was fought by many different people. The most important fighters were the enslaved people themselves. They resisted slavery every single day. They did this in small ways, like working slowly or breaking tools. They also did it in big ways. They organized rebellions and uprisings. Famous rebellions, like the Baptist War in Jamaica in 1831, sent a powerful message to Britain. This rebellion was led by Samuel Sharp. It showed that enslaved people would not accept their chains. They were willing to fight and die for their freedom, and their resistance made the system of slavery very expensive and difficult to maintain. In Britain, a powerful movement of activists grew. These were the abolitionists. They were black and white, men and women. Olaudah Equiano was a formerly enslaved man who wrote a book about his life. His story shocked many people in Britain. It showed them the true horror of slavery. Thomas Clarkson was another key figure. He traveled across the country, collecting evidence against the slave trade. He showed people the chains and tools used to punish enslaved people. These activists organized public meetings and petitions. They wanted to change public opinion and pressure the government to act. They made slavery a moral issue that no one could ignore. Women played a huge role in the abolitionist movement. They were often the ones who organized local groups. They wrote pamphlets and poems. They encouraged people to boycott sugar grown by enslaved people. This was a way for ordinary people to protest. By refusing to buy slave-grown sugar, they hit the plantation owners where it hurt in their pockets. Mary Prince, a formerly enslaved woman, told her story in a book. Her testimony was very powerful. It gave a voice to the voiceless and exposed the brutal reality of slavery from a woman's perspective. Their work built a grassroots movement that was impossible for politicians to overlook. The abolitionist movement used new methods to spread its message. They created one of the first logos for a political campaign. It was an image of a kneeling African man in chains. The caption said, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This image was put on plates, cups, and posters. It was a simple but powerful question that made people think. The movement also gathered millions of signatures on petitions. These petitions were presented to Parliament. It was one of the biggest public pressure campaigns in British history. It showed politicians that a large number of people wanted slavery to end. Several key events pushed Britain towards abolition. The successful revolution in Haiti, where enslaved people freed themselves, scared the British government. They feared similar revolts in their own colonies. The constant resistance from enslaved people, like the Baptist War in Jamaica, made running the plantations very difficult and costly. Back in Britain, the political situation was also changing. The Great Reform Act of 1832 changed who could vote. It gave more power to the middle classes, many of whom supported abolition. The economic arguments for slavery were also getting weaker, while the moral arguments were getting stronger every day. Finally, in 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. This law was a historic moment. It declared that slavery would be illegal throughout most of the British Empire. The act was a huge victory for the abolitionist movement and for the enslaved people who had fought for so long. However, the law was not as simple as it seemed. It was a compromise. It was designed to please both the abolitionists and the powerful plantation owners. The journey to true freedom was not over. The act was a beginning, not an end, and it came with significant and controversial conditions attached. The act did not free everyone immediately. Children under the age of 6 were freed, but everyone else over that age was not fully free. They became apprentices. This meant they had to continue working for their former masters for several more years. They were supposed to be paid a small wage, but in reality it was very similar to slavery. This apprenticeship system was supposed to be a transition period. The plantation owners argued they needed it to adjust to a new system of free labor. For the formerly enslaved, it felt like a betrayal. They had been promised freedom, but it was delayed. One of the most shocking parts of the act was the compensation. The British government decided to pay money to the people who had lost their property. This meant that the slave owners received huge sums of money. The government paid them £20 million. In today's money, that is many billions of pounds. This was a massive public expense. The enslaved people, however, received nothing. They were the ones who had suffered for generations. They were the ones who had been denied their freedom and their humanity. Yet they were given no money, no land, and no help to start their new lives. The slave owners were paid for their loss, but the enslaved were not paid for their suffering. After the apprenticeship period ended in 1838, more than 800,000 people were finally legally free. For them, life changed in some important ways. They could no longer be bought or sold. Their families could not be legally separated. They had the freedom to move and choose where they worked. Many left the plantations where they had been enslaved. They tried to build new lives for themselves and their families. They started their own small farms or moved to towns to find new jobs. They formed communities and built churches and schools. Freedom, even with all its challenges, was precious and brought a new sense of hope and dignity. However, the reality of life after 1833 was very difficult. The former slave owners still owned all the land and had all the power. They created new systems to control the formerly enslaved people. They passed laws that made it hard for black people to vote or own land. They often refused to pay fair wages. This meant that many formerly enslaved people were forced to go back to work on the plantations in conditions that were not much better than slavery. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty and discrimination. The racism that had justified slavery did not disappear when slavery was abolished. It continued to shape society in the Caribbean and beyond. For the British Empire, the abolition of slavery changed its image. Britain started to present itself as a moral leader in the world. It used its navy to try to stop the slave trade of other countries. This helped to justify its growing empire. It claimed it was bringing civilization to other parts of the world. But this story hid the truth. It hid the fact that Britain had been one of the biggest slave-trading nations in history. It also hid the fact that the wealth from slavery continued to benefit Britain for a very long time. The abolition was used to create a new, more positive story about the empire, one that often erased its brutal past. The abolition of slavery in 1833 is an event that still matters today. It shows us that change is possible even against powerful interests. It reminds us of the importance of fighting against injustice. But it also teaches us a more complex lesson. It shows that ending a system on paper does not always mean ending the suffering it caused. The legacy of slavery can still be seen today in the racism and inequality that exist in Britain and around the world. Understanding this history is crucial. It helps us understand the world we live in now and the long journey that is still ahead to achieve true equality for all.